Everyone, this is Morgan, and in this video I'm going to walk you through the process of making your photographic perspective study. This is part of your fourth process journal exercise for the narrative collage project. So I have already compiled a couple things, and if you haven't gotten them yet, I would encourage you to gather them before you play the rest of this video. The first is I found the photographic image that I would like to use for the perspective study. This is from the film The Favorite, and part of the reason I picked it is it's a good kind of definitive moment from the narrative, but also I found an image that has a relatively simple background. So part of this exercise is going to involve isolating this part of the photograph that I want to include in the perspective study and also potentially my collage from the background, which might not be quite as useful in my collage. So it's important to find that file first. It should be relatively large. If you need a review on how to find larger images using a Google image search, I would go all the way back to our Principles of Design scavenger hunt assignment, and I do a walkthrough tutorial on that assignment page on that Google image search process. So I found this large enough image. It's a good moment from the story. It's got a relatively simple background. That's one of the things that you should gather. The second thing is just this Journal 2 template guide, which I have in a separate tab in Photoshop. So this is something that you can also download from Canvas. What you should see when you open it is one square that is prepped for 1-point perspective, or a rectangle that's been prepped for 1-point perspective, and a second rectangle that's been prepped for 2-point perspective. There's also space at the top here, which is where you're going to plug in the unwarped version of your photograph. So we're going to go back to this image first. So whenever you pull an image off the internet, it's good to start by checking its size. So I'm going to do that now by going to image size. And I can see that it's prepped to be 13 inches by about 9 inches at this resolution of 144 pixels per inch. So let's say that, we're going to want to print this image off. So this is a low resolution for print. I'm going to start by unchecking this resample button. And the reason I'm doing that is because right now, this image is bigger in width and height than I want it to be, but it's low in resolution. So I don't need to actually change the image size at all. I just need to change how Photoshop kind of interprets the pixels that are there. So I'm going to, again, with resample unchecked, go into resolution and type in 300. And I have a much more logically sized image already. So this just means that when I eventually print this out, it's going to be at as good of a resolution as it possibly can. So I'll hit OK now. The next thing I could do, just to simplify my life, is crop in. For this image, there's a good chunk on either side that is not useful to me. So I have this defaulted to a specific ratio. I'm going to uncheck that by hitting clear. And I'll just drag out, so I'm really only getting this tiny little sliver of the image that's relevant. So the most important thing about isolating this from its background is figuring out how to make a layer mask. And what we want to do when we're making a layer mask is sort of plan on what is going to make our life easier. If I open up my layers tab, you can see that I have this layer 1 image. If you see that you have a background that is locked, I would start by clicking on the lock to unlock it. You don't want to have a locked background. I eventually am going to make a mask, and the icon for that will sit right here, and it will basically block out all parts of the image that aren't relevant to me in this particular application. And the reason we want to do that instead of delete pixels is if we make a mistake, we can always go back into a layer mask and re-edit it if we just delete pixels that are gone forever. So when you're looking at your image, the first thing you should decide is whether or not it's probably easier to select the subject that you actually want to keep or the background that you don't. So I know how Photoshop thinks, and I know that getting a selection of this entire sky is going to be relatively easy because those pixels are similar in value and color, and Photoshop is going to be able to pick up on that. This area is going to be a little bit trickier, but I think we can work with it. So I'm going to start by going over to the Magic Wand tool. That is normally the fourth tool down in Photoshop. It is sometimes hiding behind other things. So if I click here, it's going to select pixels that are contiguous, meaning they're connected to each other. And it's also set for me to a tolerance of 8 because the last project I did, I set it to 8. For most of you, it's probably defaulted to 32, and I'll see how that works. So with this higher tolerance, you can see it's selected a much larger range of pixels. It is starting to select things within her costume that I'm not quite as happy about, but it's a closer start. So I'm gonna add to the selection by holding down on the Shift key. I can also try to subtract by holding down on the Option key, and again, I'm using a Mac. And that actually did an okay job. I will maybe lower the tolerance just so I can press the Shift key again and select this area. But I've already kind of isolated the sky, which is pretty good. So in terms of selecting things quickly, the Magic Wand tool is often really useful when you're making layer masks. For this area down here, I'm going to show you a couple different additional selection tools that you could use. One is just the rectangular marquee tool, and it's the second tool in the toolbar. So again, I can just keep adding to this selection even though I'm switching tools by holding on the Shift key. So I'm going to hold down Shift, and you should be able to see there's a plus sign next to my cursor. And I'm just going to click and drag and slowly add like boxes effectively to my selection. And I'm doing that here as well. So that did a good job at getting most of it. To get this final little sliver next to her body, I could just go to the lasso tool. And the lasso tool is a freehand tool, meaning I can really just make it any shape I want. It's not a smart tool. Photoshop's not trying to help me detect borders. It's really just on me to get, you know, to make sure my fingers aren't shaking, to make sure everything's done pretty neatly. This can be really helpful anyway, especially if I press spacebar command and then zoom in, you can get some decent control. But I'm going to show you the final selection tool that I'll use in this video, which is the magnetic lasso tool. So this again was hiding behind the lasso tool. I'm going to hold Shift, and I want you to see how differently this tool works. I'm going to start by kind of trying to line it up exactly with this border point, and I am actually just very loosely going along the line of this coat, and you can even see I'm lifting my cursor a little bit above it. But this is a smart tool, so Photoshop is working to try to figure out where the edges are. Now when I double click to close it, I have a pretty decent selection. I'm going to press the space bar and drag over here to do the same thing. So again, Shift, and then just loosely following this line, Photoshop is trying to help me by identifying potential boundary points. So at this point, I have a pretty decent selection of everything but my subject. So to make a mask, it's easiest to select the actual subject. But we kind of identified that the easier thing to select, you know, on its own would be the background. Now all we have to do is go up to the select drop down and go to inverse, and now we have a really nice selection of our subject. So at this point, when I have my subject selected, I'm going to go into my layers panel and look for this add layer mask icon. It's at the bottom of your layers panel. It looks like a white rectangle with a dark circle in the center. So when I hit that, everything in the background should be edited out. Now, I also maybe was a little too zealous and cut out some things in the pistol here that I want to add back in. That's fine. I can add back into this anytime, even when I add it to that second document, the template guide document. Right now I have the layer mask selected, and I'm going to zoom in and show you how it works a little bit better. So again, triple checking that I have the layer mask selected, I'm going to go to the toolbar and find the brush tool. You could also just use the shortcut of B. So when you're using a layer mask and you have your brush tool, if you paint white, you will reveal things that you edited out. And I'm going to press Command Z to undo that. When you press black, you will be masking out more stuff. So this is why this is a more refined tool compared to just deleting pixels, as you can always edit things out. So going back to my toolbar, I'm going to switch back over to having a white foreground color, and I'm just going to paint back in some of this pistil detail that got edited out a little bit. So that looks pretty good. I might have also edited out some stuff in the hat. It kind of looked like it. I also may want to go in with a black brush, and I'll flip that over here, and just soften up this border. That's not too bad. And if you want to get really fancy, this is a more advanced Photoshop technique, but I think could be really useful to you, so I'll show it anyway. If you go to your layer mask and double click it, you may need to click a few more like buttons to agree to go into this menu, which is the select and mask menu. I'm going to check Smart Radius and drag my radius up to about 3, and it's going to try to soften the edges of my selection even further. I can even show her against maybe a black background to make the edges really clear. But you can see how this has created a really nice outline, and whenever you're happy with it, you can click OK. So this layer, I'm now going to name Pistil, is ready to be added into that template guide document.